20 best books to pick up. So I have, as you know, always loved your writing. And I think all of this speaks to just the lyrical and incredibly engaging work that you've put out over the years. So we're really excited to hear you share with us some of your thoughts on your book on Helen.
Yeah, thank you, Janie. Yeah, I was hearing from Penguin today that I was on some list. I was ahead of Sharon Stone's autobiography. So I said that I was going to take the rest of the day off, but here I am. See, like I'm still talking art, talking Helen Frankenthaler. It's interesting you mentioned about lyrical writing, and thank you for that. Though, sometimes that's can be a criticism, because I'm a professor of art history, and I'm supposed to be a scholar. I say supposed to be because I've always sat not very well in that role. And I suppose my success and failure as an academic has been in that respect, that I'm a little bit of a fish out of water. But this book is the first one where I've really had a chance to tell a story, have a book be a story rather than, let's say, an argument. And I feel that's been a nice thing for me.
Absolutely. And I just want to slip in a quasi-formal introduction for you right now. I think most people who are joining us tonight are well familiar with you and your work. But just to be official about it, Alex Nemiroff holds the position of the Carl and Marilyn Thoma Provostiel Professorship in the Arts and Humanities at Stanford, and he serves as chair of the Department of Art and Art History there. He's written prolifically about diverse aspects of art history and society in 19th and 20th century America. Alex is a 1985 graduate of UVM, and I should mention his major, I think a joint major in art history and English. And in 2018, he received an honorary degree from UVM and delivered a really moving commencement address that year. And should you want to, I would encourage you all to find that on YouTube. It's really, really quite beautiful. So I also want to mention, as we talk, feel free to post your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat, but in the Q&A. And we'll have time later in the hour for Alex to respond to your questions. Okay, let's carry on.
So yes, so thank you for that introduction, Janie. I mean, it is interesting to think about it as a Vermont book in part, though I went to UVM, as you said. It's to some extent set in Bennington, where actually I was born. Right. And I know Helen Frankenthaler had fond feelings for Bennington throughout, but I mean, there's so many things to talk about. I'm curious, for example, with the book about, well, how you as a feminist scholar respond to Helen's world in the 1950s and about her I don't know, and the fame that came to her largely or partly because of feminist art history, the emergence of it in a time after that which the book concerns. I mean, were there questions for you or revelations for you in reading the book about what it is to be an artist who is a woman at that time or subsequently?
Yeah, a lot of questions. And I remember, in conversations that we've had, and, clearly from reading the book, she did not see herself that way at all. And, it strikes me that there were a lot of interesting contradictions and dualities to her and to her work. But at the same time that she was an absolute pioneer in the art world, in a very male art world in the 1950s. She was also an Upper East Side lady. And so to see the impact that she had and the work that she did, and did not really, well, my sense is that she absolutely did not see herself as a feminist. I mean, it was really kind of a pre-feminist moment. But the impact that she had at the time, not obviously later, but even at the time was just enormous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many interesting points there, but you're right. She really resented the idea of being referred to as a woman artist. She wanted to be known as an artist who either succeeded or failed based upon the intrinsic merit of her work. And beyond that, and I think this is really, for me, the richest thing about the work and or the book and what Helen has taught me is that merit consisted in, sure, in having something to say, but more deeply in having the power to transform a viewer's life by virtue of the special fantasy that an individual work emerging from the sovereign consciousness, uh, of one maker can make possible in the world. And that, if that sounds like frightfully outdated, and if it sounds like not really a good way to write a sort of job application letter in the field of art history, or for an artist, frankly, that would be, and it's true, that would really be like box office poison to do that. It's true. Those days are gone, Janie,
Yeah.
the 1950s, when there was something called the religion of art, which had been going on, choose your date, but probably for about 60, 70 years at that point, but which was soon to end as art became sort of, I'm speaking very broadly here, but art became changed into like, kind of basis for critique, for engagement in changing the world politically, socially, etc. The fascinating thing for me, I would say the rewarding thing, Janie, for me writing about this book is that it puts forth this somewhat antiquated idea of art as a religion that unapologetically proposes that, as Rilke said, you must change your life, in a time when such things are kind of embarrassing, and yet not to me.
Yeah.
And it's one of the weird paradoxes, or maybe it's not weird at all, maybe it's just sort of normative, that all of my success as a teacher, such as it is, consists in believing in art as a religion, and believing in moments, even outside of art, that are, as we say, indelible, unpredictable, either orchestrated or not orchestrated, that just happen, that I feel we all know in our hearts make a difference in our lives and deflect us from the person we would have become otherwise. That all of this is perfectly true now. We just say it's embarrassing because we don't want to deal with that. If Helen were alive now, she died in 2011, I'm sure she would very much agree with me. And that's one of the interesting things about the book is, it's a book, Janie, about being in your 20s in a way, because it's taking Helen from when she was 20 to when she was 30, basically. And I love that about it. And people would say, why that decade? Why those paintings? And they ask me that all the time, because Helen, unlike many artists, had a very long career painting into this century. And I say, because those paintings are the young person's paintings. Those are the paintings where Helen is trying to catch life on the quick and trying to portray what it is to be alive with that sort of special ecstatic feeling, which is a feeling, an ecstasy made up of sorrow as well as joy. that a
Mhm.
young person has, and that makes my students, for example, wiser than me. And there's that. But when I was in my 20s myself, not at UVM, where I was kind of blissed out, though lawfully blissed out, I will say,
Noted.
not just because the drinking age was 18. There was like 53 bars there, and so on. But that wasn't really my thing. But I mean, lawfully blissed out in the sense as I used to stare, Janie, across the lake from the top of Williams Hall.
Yes, yes.
And this is my heaven, really. Even now, it hasn't lost its magic. Other places in Vermont have a little bit faded for me. Even like super intense kind of first girlfriend places have they seem to have lost their magic for me a little bit, but not UVM. It's interesting that way. But anyway, once I went to Yale, no fault of Yale, no fault of New Haven, but man, it was the late 80s. It was the time of deconstruction.
Yeah.
I learned to hate art. Helen Frankenthaler was living just down the road in, Stamford and of course in Manhattan.
Yeah.
And she was becoming a real arch conservative by that point. So she had kind of hardened from the liberal bohemian Upper East Side young woman that I write about in the book into not exactly pro Jesse Helms person. She wasn't that, but she did say that the kind of art that Jesse Helms condemned, you all may remember the culture wars of the late 80s, Andre Serrano's Piss Christ and the Robert Mapplethorpe X Portfolio and so on. Helen did say that those works were just not very good. She didn't agree that they should be censored, but they just said, what's happened here? We've lost.
Right.
So my point is that when I was in my 20s, I didn't have anything to say to the Helen who was my age now.
Mhm.
But now that I'm her age then, and looking back at who she was when she was my age in the 1980s, if that all computes,
Yeah.
we're totally on the same wavelength. It just took a little, not just time, but a kind of magical swirling time that travels backwards and forwards in order for me to write a book in my 50s about being in one's 20s, about an artist who, when she was in her 50s, I had not the time of day for, but who in her 20s made works that spoke to who I really was when I was in my 20s. And we talk about how straightforward perhaps a biography is as a form, hey, you just tell the life story. It's way trickier than that. And partly, well, I partly knew going in, there was no way I was going to write a, start to finish door stopper biography anyway. But the structure of the book, which is, as you know, to tell her story in just one day of each year from 1950 to 1960, I think is consistent with this notion of how mysterious time is and how a biography, to really make contact with life, has to kind of alight as firmly and as lightly as a bird on a branch on the specific episodes it finds in the archive, finds through interviews, and just stay there. And then, to go to your word, lyrical, try to evoke those descriptions with that life without killing it, So avoiding and then this happened and then that happened. And I think one thing I've learned a lot from this book is going back to this idea of storytelling, is how beautiful it is and how simple it is, but also how difficult it is. And I was telling someone that this was definitely the hardest book for me to write. Not hard because it wasn't fun. It was always really fun. But it was technically hard to do. And they were shocked because to them at least, it reads very smoothly. And so this notion of how to alight on the life of someone who herself lived life lightly, whose
Mhm.
paintings are about the light touch, about just the impression of something, and that is for me the great thing about Helen's paintings, that
Yeah.
they sort of just stop at the moment when the painting is becoming a painting, just when it's emerging as a painting, and
Yeah.
leave it there instead of freezing it, petrifying it. And they remind me in that sense, her paintings, of, say, the butterfly who is, instead of being caught by the butterfly collector in the net and then pasted into an album as a pale, desiccated specimen of life, is actually, preserved, unimpeded, undamaged in all its brightness in the art. And
Yeah.
that was my method. The method I used in writing about Helen was the method she used to make her paintings, the light
Yeah.
touch.
Yeah. A couple things. I was surprised and and very curious when I first learned that you were working on what is as close to a monograph as you have ever done to a biography. Um, and I was curious about what the structure was going to be, since your structure is always, I have always loved the unconventional structures through which you have done art history, basically. So I was really interested to read the diurnal structure, the focusing
Mhm.
on the day as she, as she had done for herself. And I think it works really, really well. The lightness that you talk about in your writing, but in her work, as being integral to what is really unusual about her work, is one of the things that I really focused on in the book, and the words that she used to describe what she was after. Um, and some of them were, if I can, if I can recall, she talked about about being clumsy, and wanting to be puzzled by the
Mhm.
forms that she had created. Talked about discomfort and awkwardness, and how being unslick was a goal. And I'm curious, this strikes me, especially working as a woman in the 50s, it strikes me as being incredibly courageous, um,
Yeah,
to
yeah.
basically take that route.
Yes, I think that courage, as your question implies, begs the question of where did it come from? How did she get that? And I
Mhm.
think a useful answer is her well-to-do background, and
Yeah.
which isn't necessarily privilege as such, because her father died when she was 11 quite suddenly, and that sent her off into this very painful, messy adolescence, featuring many psychosomatic illnesses and just a general, almost paralyzing, anxious, neurotic feeling that art rescued her from.
Right.
And I think that was powerful right there. Perhaps an answer then, kind of a deeper answer beyond just the confidence and means that her family's well-to-do upbringing gave her, the chutzpah.
Hmm.
And, her father used to say of her when Helen was a little tiny girl in the 1930s walking around in Manhattan that he would say to his wife, watch her. She's fantastic. There were three daughters and Helen was the youngest by 5 years, but she always seemed to be this star child. And I think Helen was listening when her dad said she was fantastic. And as she later said,
Exactly.
that was a good thing, but it was also a bad thing in some
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah.
I mean, was she a diva? Well, I don't know. I don't use that term, but she was
Yeah.
demanding on people for sure. But I think the deeper reason,
Yeah.
Janie, to go, like, how did she do that? How did she dare the unslick gesture, the clumsy, the awkward? How was she, in effect, the Shakespeare of the 1950s? If you think of Shakespeare's plays, you know, you could read Midsummer Night's Dream, all these transporting, airy effects, and then read, of course, Macbeth. How could the same person do Macbeth and Midsummer Night's Dream? Well, Helen could do that. Just
Yeah.
like Frank O'Hara, her friend, the poet, could do that.
Yeah.
But I think the reason is because art for her was a matter of life and death.
Mm,
You know, it's
interesting.
just that simple.
Yeah.
Or to put it slightly differently, art was a way for her to defeat the darkness, as I say in the book, not in some simple TED Talk kind of way.
Mhm.
You know, nowadays, all you have to do is go on YouTube and every last person is defeating the darkness through some means or another. But I think she really, before it was a commodified thing to do, I think she was really grinding
Mhm.
and living on that lyrical edge where when you go to the studio, you know, it's consequential. There's
Mhm.
something at risk, and it's not nothing.
Yeah.
And, you know, a lot of the book concerns the New York art world before there really was one exactly. The market for abstract paintings only kicked in later in the 1950s,
Right.
in the later part of the book. So for a lot of this time, it was just you and your paintings, you and your peers, the
Yeah.
scary older people like Pollock, who were mentors and indeed inspirations. And Pollock was Helen's biggest inspiration and taught, really blew her mind when she first saw his strip paintings. And really that was the great moment for her to realize, like, the Picasso style pictures she'd been doing before were small change and she needed to, as it were, change her life.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, that you know, it was just about internal competition with yourself, competition with your peers, competition with the scary older artists.
Yeah.
And it was an existential high wire act
Mhm.
that was sanctioned by incredible confidence, arrogance, even on the one hand, and totally crippling doubt and depression on the other. And
Absolutely.
yeah,
And this also, this really clarifies another duality that I had noticed in, you know, that you had highlighted in the book and on a number of occasions, which was just that kind of the vast distance between the private intimacy of making the work, and, you know, as you called it, the public extravagance, and in another
mhm,
instance, you described it as being grandly declarative. And I
mhm.
think it's that, you know, it's that huge distance between the intimacy and the urgency, you know, that you just described in the making of it,
Yeah,
and then the, you know, the reception, and, you know, and I guess where one of my questions is, where was she in terms of of anticipating or expecting that reception and wanting or
yeah.
needing that reception?
I think she was accustomed to having no reception pretty much. And she never really got her big due until the era of feminism, as I mentioned. She had her first big art museum show at the Whitney in 1969. But when the attention started to come, I think Helen was, you know, like many artists, jealously guarding what can and can't be said, and was outraged when people gave her criticism that wasn't, as it were, on point.
Right.
That didn't conform to her intentions, which of course is a thing that happens when one dares to write about an artist who is alive. So,
Right.
um, but on your point about intimacy and grand declarativeness, I love that you brought that up. And what I say in the book is it's like going to the Louvre, let's say, and seeing a giant 19th century history painting, except instead of, you know, the surrender of a general or the coronation of a pope, it's it's a young woman's feelings
Exactly.
on this grand
So beautiful.
scale.
But
Right,
yeah,
right.
totally,
But
it's
but
great.
with the crucial extra step that the feelings are the medium, but not the message. In other words, Helen was never someone who, shall we say, overshared,
Yes.
like today it's rainy and I feel sad.
Right.
And I want you to notice that I'm feeling kind of pouty today, and
Right.
my individuality is finally what I ask you to gawk at. Like, no. Instead, it was, and I'm kind of freestyling here, like compositing a whole series of Helens from across the book, but it would be like, I'm coming into the studio, I'm really tired, I'm mopey, or maybe I'm feeling exhilarated because my, hypochondria has proved to be just that, and I'm fine, and I'm ready to make some new work, whatever. She's just like riding along that wave, the crest of the wave of her feelings for that day. And those feelings, as is true for all of us, kind of dovetail with what we're physically living at that moment: the blue sky of the sunny day, the plash of the water in the stream, or the sight of the melting snow in the gray gutter of Manhattan on a March day, whatever it is. And that is what comes out on the work. And then the grand declaration then is born on her personal feelings, but is not about them. It's instead a kind of butterfly flight expression of life on the wing, life as lived,
Right.
as it is for all of us, and as few people can actually portray.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most artists
Exactly.
just kill off the feeling. Others don't attempt it. And then the rest of us who are not artists, of course, we more or less outsource our emotions to accredited experts and somewhat passively expect them to deliver us into the states of mind that we already possess.
Right.
So, it's sort of, we could go on and on, Janie, about this, but it's like the Fleming Museum is there, the beautiful hall, which is so magical and mysterious, just the scale of it to me. And I get that art is a thing apart. I like to go there when I was an undergrad and just be in that space, especially on cold, gray days. Somehow it was so permeable. Maybe it still is, where the cold is kind of coming through the walls. I
Yes.
kind of like that.
Yeah.
But it was a space apart. Okay, so
Yeah.
art is a space apart.
Yeah.
We do need to go to a place like the Fleming, for example, to experience a state that is not just the flux and chaos of life. However, everything that I write in the book, everything that I write in all my work, everything that I teach about concerns the relation of art and life.
Mhm.
And
Absolutely. Yeah.
if, I guess if there's anything that really bums me out is like I can be giving what I think is just the most impassioned lecture about something like this, and it always reminds me of that scene in Singing in the Rain, the one where they're doing the vaudeville dance, not Make Them Laugh, but another one, and they're really just killing themselves to do a good job, and then they're greeted with incomprehension. So in my world, that means like I'm speaking about the relation of art and life, and then finally someone says, well, how much is that painting worth?
Right.
Or was that artist crazy? Or
Yeah.
just like, wow, I don't fault them. It's just sad because art is so administered, it belongs to the administration of life, which is unfortunately one of the many forms of our disenchantment.
Yeah.
And I think I will never surrender to that, Janie,
That's good.
and my book, I think it's not about the religion of art. It is kind of sharing that fantasy that is what art can deliver us into, not as something distinct from ethical and political considerations, but precisely as a royal road,
Mhm. Yeah.
because the person transformed from within is a person who shapes the world outside
Mhm.
differently than
Mhm.
they would otherwise, with greater wisdom, strength, courage, love.
Yeah.
And, uh, I'll never get tired of talking about that.
Well, I'm grateful that you won't,
Thank you.
as I think a lot of people are. So there, I want to touch on a connection between Helen and her time, um, which was you wrote about, and I think other people have talked about, that you mentioned in your book. And I want to preface this by saying, when I first saw the cover of the book, which I love, my first thought was Nancy Drew.
Hmm.
Nancy Drew book covers of that period. And I realized, I mean, it's a fantastic Gordon Parks photograph of Helen Frankenthaler. But my understanding is that it was absolutely Helen's pose, that it wasn't styled by Parks. And it was the pose itself that when I went back to look at Nancy Drew covers, it is such a 1950s pose.
Hmm.
And, I think you had described it as demure but bold, independent woman, which was exactly what, Nancy Drew was as well.
Mhm.
And I think it's, and I wanted to circle back to that because I was fascinated by the connection that you made in the book between Helen's work and as you put it, the cult of sulky adolescence of the 1950s. And this connected to James Dean and a number of other artistic movers and shakers of the moment. And there was something in my mind. There was something to that, and I wanted just to
Mhm.
to get you to talk about that just briefly.
Yeah.
How her work connected to that specific moment in the 1950s.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, I love this connection to Nancy Drew. Although, did Helen have a roadster? Yeah.
No,
We'd have to check that, right?
not really.
I myself will just say that, yeah, that my daughters who are 19 and 16 now, I'm so glad they're past the Nancy Drew age because I have read out loud all of those books, which are kind of gathering dust in our garage now, and not a fan. Just not good writing. I just was waiting for interesting things to happen. But I mean, intellectually, I like them, but as shall we say, a good read, they're beyond me. And I can now report that a book my younger daughter, the 16-year-old, has read during COVID is Deliverance. So she's moved on from Nancy Drew to Deliverance. But anyway, about this cult of adolescence, that was in criticism that uh, that Helen received for her show in 1960, which she really didn't like. The writer, who was a woman, was saying these are hysterical paintings. They're sort of showing our culture's turn towards kind of adolescent sentimentality and overwrought emotion.
Right.
And you could think of the movies, West Side Story would be a good one, came out a little later, to cite in that regard. And Helen took it as a criticism, but I think it was fairly on point. I think it was very perceptive. And,
Yeah.
it's consistent with my love of her paintings and consistent with the book that I would like that criticism because it suggests, yes, just like James Dean with his red windbreaker in Rebel Without a Cause, this is vital. This is active, and this is Natalie Wood's red lipstick in that
Mhm,
movie.
mhm.
And, Helen did meet, as you know, from the opening chapter, she did meet Marlon Brando when
Yeah.
she went out of her way to meet and interview him as he wolfed down a lunch at some cafeteria down the street from where he was playing Stanley Kowalski in A Streetcar Named Desire. Basically, there being no difference between who he was, giving her a few pointers about fame and art in the cafeteria as he was on stage, right?
Right.
Distinctly unglamorous yet beautiful, which is kind of what Helen's work went on to portray too. So I think she was, whether she liked it or not, she was articulating that rawness of youth at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps something of the time, of that pent up, soon to be exploded energy,
Yeah.
of the 50s.
Yeah, which I say at the end of the book, it's so interesting because as the 60s turned, Helen's paintings became, in a way, square,
Yeah,
because they were, as it were, only imaginative
yeah,
and weren't, let's say, psychedelically imaginative. And they certainly were never cynical or self-aware in the way of, say, a Warhol or Lichtenstein and
yeah.
the artists that began to emerge just after the book ends. Yes, so it's a very particular kind of imagination, which, for me, myself, as I exercise my own version of that imagination, can seem really square or fuddy-duddy, I suppose. But almost going back to my UVM days and my point about lawless or lawful bliss, just that interesting distinction between lawful and lawless bliss. Absent psychedelic substances or drugs of any kind, or alcohol for that matter, it's just an interesting thing as it concerns art. Some of the greatest paintings in the Fleming, made by whomever, whenever, wherever, are some mixture of lawless and lawful, right? That there's a degree of chance, of the artist saying to herself, where am I going here? I have no idea. I'm off the map here. That is the quality that surprises us, right? And that moves us and gives us an opening to relate to another person's fantasy across the narrow threshold. It's almost like a footbridge connecting their world and ours.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Something else that struck me, and I'm just, I'm as we're talking, I'm thinking about a lot about Pollock and her relationship to him. Obviously, his process was absolutely critical in her finding her way as an artist. But I was also struck by the freedom that she felt after his death and how her work changed, and was really interested in that kind of, he was so important to her in terms of inspiration and as kind of a mentor. And then, once that ended, once he was gone, she just blossomed. And
Yeah,
fascinating, it just in terms of artistic process.
I know. And just the psychology of rivalry, ambition,
Yeah, yeah,
again, things that are not much talked about today, but which are so real and raw in the lives of artists. But yes, Pollock was killed on August 11th, 1956, in that self-inflicted car accident that claimed the life of another person who he had met only that day.
yeah.
And that fall, Helen made I think one of her greatest paintings. It's called Eden. I love it. And I think,
Incredible.
per your point, just generally, a lot of her really super great paintings, just very, I realize I'm using really refined art historical terms here. Super great. Yeah, let's edit that part out. No, I'm think that yeah, super great. I mean, just knockout paintings. Because keep in mind, Helen herself, she thought a painting was never, the criterion for judging a painting was never intellectual. It was whether it knocked you out or not. Right. So
Exactly.
I'm just channeling Helen here. I know a seance was not billed as part of our Zoom session, but there it is.
All is fair.
Right. But anyway, yes, I think Pollock's death kind of, it was like he was a kind of elephant in the room in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
For his late life decrepitude as much as for his grand achievements of the late 40s and early 50s. But also, once he died, the market for his paintings really began in earnest.
Yeah.
And that made everyone quicken their step a little bit too. And I think it all had a galvanic effect. But it is interesting, the psychology of creation. It's like when the cat is dead, the mice will play, That's basically what I felt was happening. That was my spin on what was happening then.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I was also, as everyone is, I think, interested in the competition and the cattiness among Helen and her colleague artists, Joan Mitchell and Grace Hartigan, and and they seem to have respected each other enormously, but nonetheless, were very very vocal about their feelings about
yeah. Grace Hartigan, I think she was really a friend, but
yeah,
they were kind of frenemies actually, because well, first of all, Helen, in one of her genuine but also strategic alliances, was the girlfriend of the brilliant art critic Clement Greenberg for 5 whole years, for one half of the book. Very tempestuous relationship. Yes. And Greenberg took a really dim view of Hartigan. And so that created a wedge between Hartigan and Frankenthaler.
Yeah.
And I'll say this is the kind of thing that, as a quote unquote scholar, like I would have stayed a mile away from, and even almost literally turned my nose up.
Right.
Take out the almost, right? Like literally.
Totally.
Yeah. But then you try to tell this story, and it's hard to do it well. And it's intellectually rich to tell that. So that's something I've learned. But in any case, they were basically allies. But yeah, Grace Hartigan was all about a kind of Sturm und Drang, emotionally tempestuous kind of painting that reflected the rawness of experience living in a cold water walk-up flat in lower Manhattan, and confronting your painting different definition of the religion of art, as though your life depended on it, in kind of coffee-driven cycles of exhilaration and despair, right? So the final result is some thick, churned mass of existential angst, to just speak very generally. Whereas Helen's paintings are light as air, kind of you almost think that they're like a watercolor, like a giant watercolor, pale. The New York Times critic dismissed her big, most famous one, Mountains and Sea, as pale and pleasant and decorative. Anyway, Grace Hartigan herself looked at this painting and thought privately in her diary, like, this is crap, this is nothing. I can't believe it. So going back to your point about, wow, Helen had some guts to paint the clumsy, the awkward, the light gesture. One way that's so is that her own friends and really allies were thinking privately, like, this is terrible, and she didn't care. She got depressed. She slept all afternoon for the month of February 1953. She identified with the psychosomatically ill, utterly beautiful ballerina in Charlie Chaplin's film that she had just seen called Limelight, which I talk about in the book.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
actress Claire Bloom looks a lot like Helen,
Mhm.
both beautiful. But she didn't ever say like, "Oh, you're right, my painting is terrible."
Right.
That's what I love about Helen. You
Yeah.
know, maybe the single thing I learned the most from her and maybe love the most about her is she, she absorbed the wounds of the world as deeply as many people. And frankly, she never dealt with them in the way that many of us have had the good fortune to at least be able to try to
Mhm.
try to deal, just to fight to a standstill our demons and our disappointments. She really kind of just evaded them, I think. But she, you know, she never doubted her art.
Yeah.
Never,
Yeah.
never, ever.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
there's that thing like don't apologize for what comes out of the kitchen. Never. I don't know if that's really a wise. I'm sure I've apologized many times as recently as last night, come to think
Right.
of it. And I'm doing this in my kitchen. So it's like a cinema verite thing here. But I would say I get the point, right? That you know, you have to believe in your art and to believe not dogmatically, but constantly on this knife's edge of doubt about not only a particular painting, but about everything, about this whole choice of a life.
Exactly.
That's hardcore.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that comes across so strongly in the book. She was fearless, really fearless.
She was, and I don't think I say it in so many words in the book, but I'm sure many people can relate to this, that although I'm calling you from Silicon Valley and the phrase here is everyone is an artist, I think when you really think about it, like a real artist, I mean, it's almost an unbelievable combination of elements that you need, a perfect storm,
Mm,
really.
mm,
Talent, like executive technical talent,
mhm,
uh, vision, i.e. something to say,
mm, mm.
something to explore, I guess I might put it.
The time
The
and
time, yeah.
the moment.
And yeah, it's another one, courage,
Yeah.
humility,
Yeah.
almost mixed up so you can't tell the two apart.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
how about, here's another one, luck.
Huge.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Huge. Absolutely.
Right. So she had that perfect storm. So if I had a blackboard behind me, I'd write, not everyone is an artist, or everyone is an artist not, right? And that
Yep.
on the contrary, if you are an artist, really an artist, then you have to have a lot of things going for you. They have to fall right.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and
And
that also changes in the time period. I mean, one could argue that, in the current moment, it is such a changed world in terms of making it as an artist.
yeah,
It's probably harder to make it in the gallery world, but a million times easier to make it through a million other portals like Instagram, etc. Um,
yeah,
so, your historical moment has so much to do with
right.
that.
Yeah. I think, I'd love to hear a few questions here from people. But before we go, I'll just
Yeah.
say, to go on to that, I would just say, I think it's one thing that joins Helen's time and ours across the two different kinds of audiences you're talking about, you know, basically people like filing in to see the Mona Lisa on its American tour in 1963 at the Met as though they're going to a funeral. Like art is a religion, art is
Yeah.
this incredibly dignified, dressy, philosophically profound thing automatically, to Instagram.
Mhm.
So likes and dislikes, and I have a million likes or whatever that is. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
the thing that connects those two is that it's so important for an artist to receive a meaningful response to their work. that the ethical role of the viewer is as important as it ever was. And I know one thing I try to do, and Janie, I'm sure you do this in your dealings with artists, but I really try to, when I see a show, if it's an artist I know, or even if I don't, and if I like it, I make a point to write them to say, and to just not go on and on about it, but like in 2 paragraphs,
Yeah.
or even 1, just to say something about it, which I feel to be true to my response, and which hopefully represents to them a genuine engagement with their work. Because I think absent that, even if one understands what one is signing up for, that is that being an artist is not being a journalist, and being an artist is definitely being on that island and throwing the message in a bottle out and just hoping someone receives it.
Absolutely.
It's still dispiriting to just
Yeah.
be liked, or, or to have, of course, no response at all.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I try to do the same. I think that it's so important to get that kind of feedback. Um, so I've got a couple questions for
Yeah.
you. So someone is asking about your future projects, and says, I enjoyed this book and you're writing so much. Are you working on any other books? Will you continue to write about visual artists? Are there other subjects that interest you?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'm just finishing now. It's almost like I can't bear to finish it, so I keep adding a little bit more to it. But that sounds really not good, right? Like you should just. And actually, I wrote the real end of it just about 6 weeks ago, but I keep adding parts that I know I'm going to put into the middle somewhere. But it's a book called The Forest, a fable of America in the 1830s. So it's very different, but
Yeah.
it's based on the Mellon lectures I gave at the National Gallery in 2017.
Yeah.
And actually, yes, and I was supposed to write that book right away, but this Frankenthaler book intervened. So that book is a series of vignettes, like 5 pages each, definitely incorporating what I've learned from the Frankenthaler book, that is storytelling. It's a storytelling book. It's also true to the subtitle, a fable of America in the 1830s. It is, dare I say it, made up in a lot of ways. I mean, all the characters are real historical figures, people you might well understand would be in any book about the 1830s. Andrew Jackson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Thomas Cole, Nat Turner, Edgar Allan Poe. I could go on. Margaret Fuller, just an incredible cast. But I really felt constrained in telling their stories by what is known, as it were.
I hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's really, I feel like I should write my own blurb for it.
I
It's
think
beautiful. I may be the only blurb, but I think I'm going to go ahead and that's going to be my blurb, because it's been, people say, oh, it must be your pandemic book, but no, it's just,
I cannot
I
wait to
really
do
need
that.
to do it, and actually, but it has been a lifesaver the last, I started like August 1st,
Yeah.
and it's been sane keeping for me. Thank you for the question.
So it's historical fiction, basically. I did the
Yeah.
same. I reached the limits of what I could write about Pablo Picasso, and then went off in that same direction.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think the thing one is always looking for, though, in fictionalizing is what is not you, you
Say
know.
that again. Your audio
So
got.
one identifies with, for example, I identify with Helen, but she's never me.
Yeah.
Can you hear me
Yeah.
now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So I was saying that one, the key is making it so that the people you're writing about are not you, that's
Yeah, yeah.
too indulgent in this kind of thing. Yeah.
I can't wait to read it.
So yeah, well, I'm enjoying reading it and I wrote it. So right.
Right. Um, someone asked about photos, why there were not more photos of her paintings in the book.
Hmm.
But yeah, they are amply available on the internet.
That must be true.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, I enjoyed the photographs in the book enormously. All of the
Yeah.
people that
I
she,
think there's a good point there, which is that, the book has two signatures of photos, so two little sections. And back in the planning, there was, of course, the idea that the whole book would be interspersed with photographs,
right,
and you could think of like Sally Mann's autobiography as a very good
yeah,
example of that. But I thought I really pitched that it not be that way. And I think the reason is I've come to, I don't know if dislike illustrations is the word, but really feel that
mhm,
I felt like I should be able to tell the story without pictures
mhm,
or without being, as it were, interrupted by
right,
pictures.
exactly.
And for any writers out there, I encourage this because, or art historians. In fact, the Forest book is going to be the same. All the pictures, there'll be a lot more in that book, are all going to be in the back,
That's
just like in the old days of art history,
that's great.
just to make that book be so absolutely consummately saleable, as
Yeah.
as touching on what all America is trying to read about, which is the 1830s.
I think that's great. And I too, I love that separating them actually. So the images are
Oh,
not
good. Yeah.
illustrative, but you have more space, to really read. So we are coming to the end of our hour. This was really terrific. It was great to reconnect with you and to talk about Fierce Poise. And I'm not sure I had said this, but I love the title. It is so perfect. And it really
Thank you.
gets that duality or that dichotomy in her as well. So on behalf of the UVM Alumni Association, thank you, Alex, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And I also, I want to remind you all that a recording of tonight's talk is going to be found on the UVM Alumni Association website soon. And you'll be able to find it there along with other really interesting chats that have taken place on this platform. So thank you, Alex. Thank you, UVM Alumni Association. And
Yeah. Thank you, Janie. And thank you, Andrea, for setting this up. And thank you all for coming. Okay.
it's a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.